Recording in progress.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar with eLotus. We have been hosting educational courses at eLotus for over 2 decades and are proud to be your trusted source of premium CEU content with over 250 speakers, 900 courses, and 3,500 hours of continuing education. My name is Donna Chow and I'll be hosting and moderating today's class. We're so glad that you guys can join us today. Today's webinar is the antibiotic effect of Chinese herbs presented by Dr. John Chen, who is a recognized authority in both Western pharmacology and Chinese herbal medicine. He is the leading author for the Chinese medical herbology and pharmacology, Chinese herbal formulas and applications, and Chinese herbal formulas for veterinarians books. More information about the herbs Dr. Chen will share today can be found in his books, which can be purchased from evherbs.com. To find past webinars presented by Dr. Chen and also earn continuing education credits, you can find his courses on our website at elotus.org. Today's class will run from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific time. And for important information about today's webinar, we're going to cover the chat room, questions for our instructor, and your CEU quiz. For the chat room, please set your chat to everyone so that everyone can be part of the conversation. For questions for Dr. Chen, please type your questions into the Q&A box. That way we can keep the questions for Dr. Chen separate from the chat room chatter. And finally, your CEU quiz. The quiz will be available tomorrow and I'll send you guys an email when that is ready. All right, let's go ahead and begin today's class and welcome Dr. Chen.
Okay, let me do a quick sound check and video check. So those of you who are watching today's webinar, please type in the chat whether the sound and video are coming through fine before I start. So Sam, let me know if we are ready to go. Okay, sounds good. We got 2 thumbs up. All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for coming to today's webinar. Today's topic is going to be the antibiotic effect of Chinese herbs. And what you see on this first slide is the antibiotic and anti-inflammatory effect of Chinese herbs. And the reason is because I'm breaking this topic into 2 separate webinars. So one of them will be presented today, which is the antibiotic effect of Chinese herbs. Okay, and the next one is going to be anti-inflammatory effect of Chinese herbs, and that will be on May 9th, 2023. Okay, so in about 2 months or so. And these 2 topics are a little bit different, but at the same time, they have a lot of overlapping concepts. So I would strongly encourage that if you have a chance, obviously attend today's lecture, but also the one coming up in May. And the reason is because even though from a pharmacological perspective, drugs that are antibiotics and drugs that are anti-inflammatories are completely different. So if you study the drugs, they are in completely different class. But what happened is when you are looking at the clinical situation, what happened is when you have an infection, you almost always will have inflammation as well, because those are things that just go hand in hand. So therefore, when in Western medicine, when treatments are given, when drugs are given, you oftentimes will have both antibiotic drugs and also some other supporting drugs, including anti-inflammatories. And in Chinese medicine, what happened is both of these conditions are considered heat. So whether you have an infection or inflammation, both are heat conditions. But what happened is there are many different representations of heat. So you can't just say heat and be done with, but rather you have to go much deeper to make differential diagnosis or pattern differentiation to determine what type of heat it is, and also where is the heat at, right? So from what you can see on this slide here, we in TCM differentiate heat into excess heat, deficiency heat, damp heat, toxic heat, and also the heat and fire. And also, depending on where the heat is, it could be exterior heat, most often will be wind heat, or perhaps it has traveled to the interior, and then it could affect different organs, whether heart, lung, liver, gallbladder, stomach, and so on. All right, so differential diagnosis is very important when you treat heat. And similarly, okay, if you look into the heat clearing herbs, single herbs, and formulas, in addition to just saying these are clear heat, they actually have many, many different pharmacological effect. All right, so the very basic is that many of them will have antibiotic effect, and antibiotic in this case refers to effect against many different bioorganisms. And that includes antibacterial, antiviral, antitoxin, antiparasitic, anti-cancer even. All right, so a lot of the heat clearing herbs have a very wide range of antibiotic effect like this. Some of them will also regulate the immune system, so they have immunologic effect. Some have anti-allergic, antipyretic, anti-inflammatory effect. All right, so once again, heat clearing herb is a very broad category that have probably 50, 100 herbs or more, and they have a wide range of pharmacological effect as well. And in fact, it may be counterintuitive, but a lot of these heat clearing herbs actually help tremendously to protect different parts of the body, including the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, the heart, the nerve, and so on. And that's why you have these gastroprotective and all the protective effect. And these effects, in a very simplistic term, are directly related to the anti-inflammatory effect. And the reason is because when you have an inflammation, which is heat, inflammation condition for a long period of time, then what happens is the heat will then consume qi and damage yin, and yin is the body, right? So what happens is chronic inflammation condition then will attack and damage different parts of the body. And in turn, herbs that clear heat will eliminate or reduce or manage the inflammatory condition, and in turn, prevent or restore the functions or anatomy of these organs. Okay, so it's quite interesting that if you think about heat clearing herb, some of them are bitter and cold, so they are very strong, maybe even drying, but others are sweet and cold. And it's usually the sweet and cold herbs, perhaps the one that clear deficiency heat, tend to have stronger of these protective effects. So basically, they help to reduce inflammation, nourish in, and help to restore the organs of the body. So basically, if you take this all together, the best summation is that not all heat conditions are the same, and not all heat clearing herbs are created equal. Okay, so you have to differentiate what kind of heat is it. Is it from infection, inflammation, elevated metabolism? Is it from fever or something else? Okay, and not all heat clearing herbs are created equal. Some have antibiotic effects, some have anti-cancer effects, some have organ protective effects, some have, many. Okay, so in order to get the best treatment for the patient, we do have to understand the disease from a Western and TCM perspective. We do have to dig in and learn more about the herbs, both from the TCM effect and also from their pharmacological effect. And I think that's the best way to learn, to see it from all different perspectives. All right, so today we will focus mostly on the antibiotic effect of Chinese herb. And like I mentioned, please come back and watch the seminar in May about the anti-inflammatory effect of Chinese herbs. All right, so we'll go back just a bit and talk a little bit about the history of antibiotic drugs. Okay, so this is a quick summation of how and what antibiotic drugs were invented. Okay, so basically it starts with beta-lactams, and that's a category name that includes the oldest antibiotics, including penicillin, amoxicillin, and so on. And from that point on, I would say the race is on. And the reason is because when penicillin was first invented, it was really a magic bullet. It was very, very effective to treat many different infections, and the side effect was very manageable. All right, so what happened was it was used for just about everything. It was overused, overabused, and then eventually that leads to the mutation of the bacteria. And once the bacteria mutate, it is no longer susceptible to penicillin. So the drug company and the scientists will then have to come up with the next antibiotic drug that can treat the penicillin-resistant bacteria. So they come up with a new drug, and then bacteria become resistant to the drug. They then have to come up with another drug. And that's basically the evolution of these drugs, and also the evolution of bacteria mutation and resistance. So you had then the sulfa drugs, the aminoglycosides, tetracyclines, quinolones, and so on and so forth. So basically, drugs are becoming more and more powerful, and along with that, they come with more and more side effects. And bacteria are also mutating all the time, and in fact, they are becoming more and more resistant. And in fact, at this point in time, there are strains of bacteria that are superbugs. And basically what that means is these bacteria are resistant or do not respond to any of the antibiotic drugs that we know today. Okay, so those are usually referred to as nosocomial infection, basically the worst kind of infection that you usually get in the hospitals, okay, because that's where the bacteria live all year round, all decade, for a long period of time. So they have gotten resistant to every single drug. So if unfortunately a patient ends up with one of those infections, then unfortunately none of these drugs are really going to do anything. Okay, so that would be the worst case scenario. Okay, as far as clinically, how the drugs are usually given is on an outpatient basis. Most of the physician will see what type of infection you have, whether it's a lung infection, throat infection, maybe urinary tract infection. So they will base where the infection is and then prescribe what is generally considered the first-line therapy, the most likely the most effective antibiotic. But if the infection becomes more severe or the patient is in the hospital, then they may do a culture and sensitivity test. And what it is basically is to get samples from your nose, from your mouth or affected area, and then try to grow the bacteria against several samples of antibiotics. And then they can determine, number one, what type of infection it is, and number two, what antibiotic drug to use. So this will give them a lot more precise information of what to do and what drug to prescribe. Okay, so in this regard, it's much more precise than, say, taking a pulse or look at the tongue. And this is one of the main advantages of Western medicine, that the diagnosis is often, or in terms of this diagnosis, is often very precise and very objective. All right. And then once again, if we go back to the history and discovery of antibiotics, what happened is a lot of them actually come from natural sources. So like we mentioned, penicillin is the very first one, and it was actually discovered by accident. It was discovered when a petri dish was contaminated. And what they found was that the penicillin mold is actually able to produce a lot of byproducts that kills the bacteria, so the bacteria cannot invade its space and also kill the mold. Okay, so basically, to make a long story short, all living organism in this world needs to struggle and survive. And part of the struggle and survive is to fend off the offending organism. So in this case, the mold needs to fend off the bacteria. And its mechanism of doing that is to produce a byproduct. And that byproduct, in fact, is penicillin. All right. So that was how penicillin was first discovered. Okay. And then this second drug is one called gentamicin. And gentamicin is generally considered to be one of the most powerful antibiotics. Okay, so it is able to kill most of the bacteria out there, but unfortunately, it's also quite toxic. It's most toxic probably to the kidney and also to the ear. All right, and gentamicin is also discovered as a byproduct of bacteria. So from this slide here, you actually don't see anything on the left-hand side, but that's basically where bacteria is. Bacteria is everywhere. So any microorganism, whether it's mold or bacteria or others, once again, have to struggle and survive, and they produce different byproducts that can then be harvested and made into antibiotic drugs. All right, this next one is very interesting. Tamiflu is obviously one of the older drug, one of the original drug that was used to treat SARS. And it's actually a derivative from a Chinese herb called 八角茴香, which is commonly known as a star anise. All right. And this is interesting because star anise is originally used in TCM as an herb that warmed the middle jiao. Okay, so patient with spleen and stomach cold that had poor digestive function. It's also used frequently in Chinese cooking, to give the food a little bit more flavor and spice. Okay, but the drug company was able to identify the raw compound within the herb, extract it, and then subsequently made into a drug, Tamiflu, for viral infection. Okay, so once again, this is an antiviral drug, and it also comes from natural sources. And in this case, it comes from a Chinese herb. Okay, and this one is probably an example that we TCM practitioners are all aware of. And this is Qinghao Artemisia that yields a compound called artemisinin or Qinghao Su. And this is one of the most effective compounds for treating malaria. All right. And the criteria, the important criteria in this case is it's most effective if you take the fresh herb. Okay, so basically take the fresh herb, grind it into juice, and take the juice if you can, or take the decoction. Not going to be quite effective if the herb is dry or the product has been sat for a long time. Okay, so if you're using this herb for this purpose as an anti-malarial herb, then get the fresh herb if possible. Or if not, then try to get the herb in which it's extracted at low temperature as much as possible, and then also collect the essential oil. All right, this is an example of an anti-cancer drug called Taxol, and it's derived from a tree called the Pacific yew tree, and it's primarily the bark that yields the anti-cancer drug. And then finally, two anti-cancer drugs. One is called vinblastine, one is called vincristine, and they are both derived from Changchunhua, which is this flower that you probably commonly see in different garden decorations. All right. So my point here is a lot of drugs, whether it's antibacterial, antiviral, anti-cancer, anti-malarial, and so on, are derived from the natural sources. And the reason is because nature has millions of years to evolve, and all the living things, whether it's plants or bacteria or mold or plants or human, they all have to struggle and survive. And we have many different, I don't want to say the word enemy, but in a way it is enemy that we have to survive against. So natural products, natural organisms over time have developed a lot of ways to fend off the aggressor. So a lot of those plants, a lot of those bacteria, fungus, and so on, in fact, yield the most effective antibacterial, antiviral, anti-cancer type of drugs. Okay, so it is no wonder that many of the Chinese herbs, in fact, have the same effect. All right, so that's a quick look into the Western world and also all the pharmaceutical drugs. And let's also take just a few minutes to look at the TCM history and how we got to where we are. And I think that's very important to understand why many of the herbs do what they do. All right, so as far as TCM goes, there are two primary theories within TCM. One is called Sanghan, which is cold damage, and the other one is called Wenbing, which is warm disease. Okay, this person or this doctor is Dr. Zhang Zhongjing, and he lived and practiced medicine between 150 and 219 Common Era. Okay, and he in fact lived in a very treacherous or troubled time in the history of Chinese culture. And what I mean by that is he lived during a time from the transition of Eastern Han Dynasty to the Three Kingdoms, okay? Or the novel would say the romance of the Three Kingdoms. But I think it's far from a romance, because what happened is when you have one dynasty that's near the end, that's near collapse, and another dynasty is about to take over, basically it's a history of civil war, where different warlords, different kingdoms are fighting against each other. And in this case, you have the decline of one Eastern Han, and then three kingdoms that are fighting amongst each other. So what that means is an even more extensive war between not just two, but rather three oppositions. So what happened is it was generally described during that time, span of, I think, 10 to 20 years, up to 70% of the population die, okay, either from war, from famine, from infection, and so on and so forth. And that includes Dr. Zhang Zhongjing's family. Okay, so that was the background behind his life story, where he grew up, how he practiced medicine. And what happened was near the end, he decided to sit down and write down all his life experience. And that life experience eventually translates into one magnum opus, which is called Sanghan Zha Bing Lun. And Sanghan Zha Bing Lun is co-induced disorder and miscellaneous disease. That one book eventually got separated into two separate books. One is called Sanghan Lun, which is co-induced disorder. And the other one is called Jin Gui Yao Lue, which is a golden chamber or golden cabinet classics. Okay, so Sanghan Lun is more for externally contracted disorder, so infection, and Jin Gui Yao Lue is more for the internally generated disorder. Okay, so for this particular class, we'll focus on Sanghan Lun. And according to Dr. Zhang Zhongjing, Sanghan is basically a theory that describes six stages of illness, from the exterior to the interior, from the yang to the yin, or more specifically, Taiyang, Yangming, Shaoyang, and then to Taiyin, Shaoyin, and Jueyin. And with each one of these stages, he then would differentiate and then come up with corresponding signs and symptom TCM patterns, as well as herbal formula that can be used to treat these conditions. And this is such a monumental work that all the TCM practitioners after him would have to study it in order to really understand and practice TCM. And that includes us today in the United States or wherever you're watching this from, that as we go through TCM school, we are still studying this book that was written about 1800 years ago. And that shows you how important this work is. All right. And what happened is during that period of time, most of the Chinese culture, most of the Chinese people live in the northern part of China. Okay. But as time goes on, that space near Beijing, of course, became quite crowded. So they start to spread to the rest of China. And of course, a lot of people move south. And what happened is as people move south, the temperature is different, the climate is different, and the disease that they see is also different. Okay, so what used to be most common in the northern part of China as cold disease, when people move south, they start to see different patterns, primarily the heat type of disease. But what happened is Chinese culture as a whole have the mentality to respect the elder, to respect the ancient wisdom. So even though as they move farther south and they see different pattern of heat disease, most of the doctors dare not to deviate from the gold standard of co-induced disorder, Shanghai. So they apply the same principle, even though they may not fit. They use the same formula, even though it may not be the best formula. And from the classic manuscripts, it was described that these treatments did not work. And then there were, people that got sick and they died everywhere. In fact, that covered all the streets. Okay. So it took a long time before a lot of these physicians in the southern part of China, thousands of years later, begin to question and look for something else. Okay, and one of the most significant development starting here is the Wenbing, which is the worm disease. And one of the first physicians that start to observe and talk about these differences is Dr. Wu Youxing. Okay, and he lived between 1580 to 1660s. And what he would do, and this is one of the classic drawing, is that he would go to the epicenter of where these diseases are happening. And he would go interview patient, talk to the patient to see exactly what they have and what the pattern looks like, and so on and so forth. So it's almost as if you would go back to 3 years ago when COVID first happened, right? Everybody was trying to run away. Everybody was trying to lock themselves in isolation, okay, and then put on mask and hazmat suit and so on. But rather, what this doctor did is went right into the epicenter, and obviously he did not have any of those protection or barriers, but rather he just went right in to talk to the patient, see them firsthand, and get as much information as he can. And in the end, these are 3 main points that he observed and published. The first one is this is called Wen-Yi or worm epidemic. It's not caused by wind, cold, summer heat, or dampness, but rather by something he called Li Qi, which is perverse qi. So this is quite different from the original TCM concept, where a lot of these weather or environmental factor, whether it's wind or cold or damp or heat, is the cause of disease. But rather it's a qi, it's an energetic that you can't quite see or pin down. And he further elaborated that this Li Qi, perverse qi, exists in the universe, but has no sound, no smell, no shade, and no shadow. Okay. From what we know today, he is obviously describing the microorganisms, whether it's bacteria or virus. But back then, they did not have microscope, so they obviously cannot see what it is, all right? But basically, it's a disease factor that you cannot see, you cannot smell, you cannot taste. And then lastly, he observed that Li Qi, perverse qi, may be transmitted from one person to another via heaven or earth. And then people that are weak or deficient are most likely to be affected. All right. So here, most likely is describing the method of transmission and also who is most likely going to be affected. So in a way, you can describe him as the early father of Chinese infectious disease and also immunology, because he recognized how the disease was caused and also who is most likely to be affected. Okay. And his finding is then written in a book called Wen Li Lun, Discussion of Epidemic Worm Diseases. All right. And his work is then carried on by another doctor called Ye Gui, also known as Ye Tiansi. All right. So he went a step further to start to develop TCM theories of these worm diseases. And what he, in the end, published was a book called Wen Ze Lun, and he described the disease to once again go from the exterior to the interior, but following the steps of Wei, which is the defensive level, Qi, energy level, Yin, nutritive level, and Xue, blood level. So basically from the exterior to the interior, but slightly different pathway, slightly different description. But the idea is the same as the Sanghan Lun, basically from exterior to interior. But signs and symptom, clinical manifestation is a little bit different. And then finally, you have another doctor called Wu Tang or Wu Jitong. Okay, he also made a lot of progress in terms of theoretical and pattern differentiation. In this case, he summarized a disease of warm disease to go from upper to middle to lower jiao. So 三焦辩证. Okay, so as we see infectious disease today, these are three patterns of differentiation that are probably most useful. Whether it's 六经辩证, 6 stages, 温气、胃气、营血辩证, so this is the 4 levels, or 三焦辩证, the 3 burners. Okay, so these are 3 ways, 3 patterns to keep in mind when the patient comes in and they have infectious disease. Another thing that's very helpful is the organ or pattern differentiation. Because a lot of time when the patient has an infectious disease, it may tend to start at certain organs in the body. And then if the disease is not treated well, then it can spread to other parts of the body. So these parts of the body could be the lung, could be the stomach, could be the urinary tract, could be the kidney, could be, whichever organ it is. And in this case, it's more straightforward because even though the TCM organs is not always the same as a Western anatomical organ, a lot of them are referring to the same anatomical structure itself, even if the functions are not exactly the same description-wise. All right, so in this case, it's quite useful when we look at the formulas and also what they are and what they do to where the infection is. And what I mean by that is a lot of the classic formulas would describe where the heat is, and in a way is telling you what the formula treats. So in this case, where the infection is and where the inflammation is. So for example, 清鼻汤 clear the nose decoction is a great formula to treat sinusitis and rhinitis, basically issues with the nose or specifically heat affecting the nose. Okay, so sinusitis, rhinitis, perhaps even sinus infection. Okay, the next formula is 清肺饮 clear the lung drink. So this is a great formula to treat heat in the lung. Okay, so in this case, both heat in terms of infection and also heat in terms of inflammation. So the patient may have cough and wheezing and chest congestion and phlegm and so on. Okay, then the next formula is called 清胃散 clear the stomach powder. So this is a formula for treating stomach heat. In this case, stomach heat could represent stomach infection. So this could be the H. pylori infection, or it could be the increase in production of stomach acid. So acid reflux, esophageal reflux disease, or GERD, that type of things. So 清胃散 clear the stomach powder refers to a great formula that clears stomach heat. All right, so if you think about this, you can think about this as herbal formulas that have localized antibiotic effect. Okay, so they treat heat, they treat infection, affecting a specific part of the body. Other formula that also treat heat affecting a certain part of the body uses the name of the chief herbs to imply what they are and what they do. So in the previous slide, most of the formula tell you where the heat is based on organ, okay, based on location. In this case, you need to know what the herbs are or what the name says, and then you have a good interpretation of what they treat. So for example, 银翘散, yin refers to 金银花, which is honeysuckle, and chao refers to 连翘, which is forsythia. And these are 2 of the best herbs for treating wound heat, or in other words, early stage of bacterial and viral infection that affect mostly the outer parts of the body, maybe the mouth, the throat, or maybe headache and so on. So basically the virus or infection has not gone inside the body into the lung just yet. Okay, so this is a great formula to use for the early parts when the patient first show warning sign, when it's mostly exterior. Okay, next formula is called 葛根芩连汤. 葛根 is Puaria or Kutsu, Huangqin is Utalaria, and Huanglian is cactus. So this is a formula for treating DMP affecting the intestines. So in other words, patients that have traveler's diarrhea, that have dysentery, that have gastroenteritis, basically DMP affecting the intestines. All right, so these patients have infection. They probably also have food poisoning. They probably also have horrible diarrhea. So Gergen Puaria has an ascending effect to lift qi upwards, therefore to help to stop diarrhea. And then Huangqin and Huanglian are two of the best antibiotic herbs, heat-clearing herbs that treat infection. So Huanglian and Huangqin are the ones that treat the infection, which is the root cause, and Gergen lift the qi up to stop diarrhea, which is to treat the symptom associated with the disease. So this is a great formula to take with you anytime you have food poisoning or anytime you want to travel to countries in which sanitation is not guaranteed. So basically higher chance that you may end up with food poisoning or traveler's diarrhea as you go to different places. Okay. Next one is a formula called Ba Zheng San, a herb powder for rectification. So what this formula really implies is that it's a formula with 8 herbs, and it's to rectify, and the situation that it's trying to rectify is DMP in the lower jaw. And this is a great formula for a localized urinary tract infection, whether it's urinary tract infection or cystitis, basically things, in that general region. Okay, so once again, it's a localized antibiotic herbal formula. And once you know what the formula is, it's quite easy to make differential diagnosis and apply and use this formula. Okay, and the last one is called Wu Wei Xiao Du Yin, literally means the 5-ingredient decoction to eliminate toxins. So this formula has 5 main ingredients, and toxin refers to the infection or inflammation in which there is pus or abscess or discharge. And this formula application-wise is best for infection that affect the superficial parts of the body. So it's historically most effective for snake bite, insect bite, cellulitis, abscess that affect the skin level. Okay, and then to switch gear, the ones prior to here, like I mentioned, they are to treat a localized area type of heat or localized herbal antibiotic formula. These next 3 are what I would consider as formula that treat a broad part of the body, or you can consider them as broad spectrum herbal antibiotics that treat systemic representation of heat and infection. And the first one will be Longdan Xie Gan Tang, and this is a great formula that treats various types of infection and inflammation that's all along the liver and gallbladder channel. It has great antibacterial effect. It has great antiviral effect. It treats the lower jaw, middle jaw, and upper jaw. It's great for urinary tract infection. It's great for herpes and shingles. It's also great for ear infection. Okay, so this is one of those formulas that you can use as a first-line treatment if the disease pattern fits. You can also use it as a last resort if some of the formula you used in the beginning happen to fail. Okay, the next formula is called Huanglian Jiedu Tang, and this is another one of my favorite formula. In a way, once again, for treating systemic infection, or another way to think of it is it's kind of like a shotgun therapy, that it treats infection everywhere in the body. So as a last resort, you can always use it. Or if you are traveling to different places and you're not sure what type of infection you may get, it could be, respiratory tract infection, it could be GI infection, it could be, other type of infection, and you don't want to bring a whole suitcase of herbs, then Huanglian Jiedu Tang is excellent. Basically what it is it has Huangqin for upper jaw, Huanglian for middle jaw, Huangbai for lower jaw, and also Zhizi gardenia that treats heat in all 3 jaw. So basically, once again, it's a formula that treats infection in many different parts of the body. Okay, and last one is another one of my favorite formula. This formula is called Pu Ji Xiao Du Yin. Pu Ji refers to benefit the universe. 消毒, once again, is to treat heat and toxin, perhaps with some pus and abscess, or if it's still in the lung, then it's probably pus and phlegm and sputum. Okay, but what it is it's a great formula that was originally described to treat the whole universe. So that whole universe, philosophically, could mean one family, one school, one town, or one village. So basically, as the epidemic hits, it affects one person who then passes it on to all the people in the surrounding area. So that's the small universe we are referring to. Okay, so this is a great formula to work anytime we are treating epidemic or pandemic or different type of contagious infections. Okay, so once again, it's a great formula to use as a last resort when a more specific formula that target a specific organ happen to fail or not work. Okay, and you want to do that, right? You know, if you have a patient that comes in with a localized specific infection, it's better to come up with a specific formula for treating the infection at that location. Generally speaking, you'll get much better effect. But like I mentioned, if that happens to fail, if and you try something else, it doesn't work, these broad spectrum herbal antibiotics, generally speaking, are the good last resort as the disease continue to progress and some of your early attempts happen to fail. Okay, so don't use these first, but rather use them after one or two failed attempts. All right, so far, this is to give you a more broad look into how the TCM theories work and also some of the classic herbal formulas. All right, so now what we'll do is we'll drill down and talk about specific herbs and what antibiotic effect they have specifically, and also what they treat and how they work. Okay, so in a way, this is going into the pharmacology of the Chinese herbs. All right, and like we mentioned earlier, anti means it means against, and bio is the living organism. So when we say antibiotic effect, it really is much broader than just antibacterial. Okay, so these are herbs that have effect to inhibit or kill many different bioorganisms, and that includes bacteria, virus, fungus, amoeba, parasites, and even cancer cells. Okay, so a lot of the heat-clearing herbs, depending on which ones, will have various of these effects. And antibacterial is by far the most common. Okay, and these are just some examples of Chinese herbs that have antibacterial effect. Okay, and this is actually one of my favorite slides. And the reason is not because I want you to all write this down. The reason is because my point with this slide is to show you that there are many, many, many Chinese herbs that have significant antibacterial effect. Okay, so most of these are heat-clearing herbs, but not all of them. There are other herbs. There are herbs in other chapters that are not heat-clearing herbs that do have a secondary or tertiary effect that is a good antibacterial effect. So once again, my point with this slide is that remember that there are many herbs that clear heat, whether there's excess heat or deficiency heat or heat and fire or damp heat, that have significant antibacterial effect. So there's no reason why we cannot use Chinese herb or herbal formula to treat bacterial infection. And more specifically, and this is an area where a lot of research has been done, it's not just antibacterial effect, but we know which herb or even which compound is effective specifically against which microorganism, whether Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, Salmonella, E. coli, H. pylori, or even the mutated bacteria, whether it's methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA or MRSA, or penicillin-resistant Staph aureus, PRSA. Okay, so this type of research is not too hard to do, because basically what you need to do is get the herb or the extract of the herb and then isolate various cultures of these bacteria and put them next to the herbal extract. If the herb is able to kill the colonies of these bacteria, that means this herb is effective against that strain. All right, so this being one of the easier research to do, there is a lot of information available in this area. Okay, so if you happen to have a patient that comes in And somehow the MD has done specific culture and sensitivity tests. So they know exactly what the microorganism is. Then what you can also do is take corresponding information, match it with herb that is specifically effective against that microorganism. Then you can come up with a much more specific, much more effective herbal formula to treat that particular infection. So once again, the previous slide was to show herbs with antibacterial effects. So that's very general. These are herbs that specifically have anti-streptococcus effect. So once again, if the infection is a streptococcus infection, these are the herbs you can narrow down to. If the infection is a H. pylori infection of the stomach, then these are the herbs you can consider using. And then if the patient has MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, these are the herbs you can use. Okay, so once again, this type of information is readily available. You can look them up in textbooks, or you can look them up online in different PubMed type of peer review studies. Okay, so for those of you who are more interested in Western medicine or learning about pharmacology of herb, there is really not a shortage of information. All right, so let's now dive even deeper. Okay, so instead of saying these are the umbrella of herbs, let's dive into some specific examples. These are 4 of the herbs that are most frequently used to treat infection. Okay, so huangqin, like I mentioned, for upper jiao, Scutellaria; huanglian, coptis, for middle jiao; huangbai, philodendron, for lower jiao. And that's their most effective specificity. It doesn't mean they only go to upper, middle, or lower, but they are most effective for that region. And then zizhi gardenia is for treating heat throughout the entire body. So these are 4 herbs that are most frequently used for treating heat. And these are 4 herbs that have excellent antibiotic effect, or in this case, specifically antibacterial effect. And 3 of them have the word huang, yellow, in a way to imply that yellow is heat. So these are the herbs that are good to treat heat condition. So let's start with huangqin or huanglian. So huanglian, this is what the plant looks like, and this is what the raw herb or bulk herb looks like. Okay, so a little bit of review into herbology 101. All right, the TCM classic description is huanglian is an herb that clears heat and dries dampness, and it sedates fire and also eliminates toxins. Okay, so the classic description is useful to give you a general guidance of what the herb does. But in a way, it's also a bit vague. It doesn't convey a lot of specific information. And what they have found is that this herb has a lot of excellent pharmacological effect, including antibacterial, and then more specifically bacteriostatic and also bactericidal. And what that means is antibacterial basically means they are effective against the bacteria, but more specifically bacteriostatic. Static means to stay the same. That means there are compounds in this herb that can block the multiplication and growth of the bacteria. So basically, it may not kill the bacteria right away, but it'll stop it from growing. And eventually, if it doesn't grow, and eventually it will die. Okay, so it's effective, but may not be as quickly as effective as the bactericidal. Bactericidal means it has a killing effect on the bacteria. So once you have a drug or herb with bactericidal effect, generally speaking, you will start to work a lot faster. So that's the difference between bacteriostatic and bactericidal. And in a bit later, we'll talk about why this may be the case, or what are the compounds that may be responsible for some bactericidal or bacteriostatic effect. Antitoxin, in a pharmacological sense, this is a little bit from TCM. Antitoxin means when a bacteria is killed, a lot of time as it dies, it produces a lot of endotoxins. And endotoxins are the ones that creates a lot of toxic reactions in the patients, whether it's fever or pain or chills and so on and so forth. Okay, so in a way, it's not enough to just kill the bacteria. You also want to address the complications as the bacteria dies. All right, so a lot of the herb also have antitoxin effect once the bacteria is killed to minimize the complications of treating the infection. Then this herb Huanglian also has antiviral, antifungal, and antiparasitic effect. But primarily, it's most effective as antibacterial, antiviral, and also antitoxin effect. All right. Specifically, Huanglian cactus has a broad spectrum of antibacterial effect. So broad spectrum means it's effective against a very wide range of many bacteria, including bacillus, dysentery, mycobacterium, salmonella, E. coli, cholera, bacillus, pseudomonas, diplococcus, staphylococcus, streptococcus, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the more wide spectrum an herb is, obviously that means the more application it has. Okay, so it's able to treat many different types of infection that affect many different parts of the body. Okay, and that's why Huanglian cactus is one of the most commonly used herb in Chinese herbal medicine. Okay, and then in the last sentence here, it says the inhibitory effect is the strongest against E. coli, mycobacterium, tuberculosis, and also Staphylococcus aureus. All right, so if you have a patient with those three types of infection, then Huanglian is one of the best choice to use. And mycobacterium is important because mycobacterium is a bacteria that causes tuberculosis. And this is an infection that's actually quite hard to treat and also take a long time to treat. Okay, so if the patient has TB, then Huanglian is in fact a good choice. Okay, and within Huanglian, and it's probably hundreds of different compounds, berberine is usually considered to be one of the most important compounds. And berberine in Chinese is known as Huanglian Su. And in fact, in China, this is actually a drug. So Huanglian is a Chinese herb, and then Huanglian Su or berberine is isolated and synthesized and sold as a drug. In the US, you can also buy it too, except you can buy it on Amazon or anywhere on the web, except it's just sold as a dietary supplement. Okay. Well, let's look into it first, then I'll give you some of my other thoughts. Okay, so berberine from Huanglian has a significant antimicrobial activity against many different strains of MRSA. Okay, so the herb works against MRSA, but as a synthetic compound, it's much more isolated, it's much stronger. So this is in fact a good option to use if the patient has a severe infection like MRSA. So what berberine does is it lowers the minimum inhibition concentration of ampicillin and oxacillin against MRSA. So what that means is if the patient has this infection, though the drug may still work, you need a much higher dosage to work. But if you are able to combine berberine with it, then you can significantly lower the dose of the drug and therefore lower the cost and also reduce the side effect associated with the drug. So in a way, you can think of this also as a herb-drug interaction where the herb and drug are interacting with each other, but the net benefit is that you can use less of the drugs and still achieve the same outcome. Okay, so in this case, berberine and ampicillin is described to have an additive effect. So 1 + 1 = 2, okay? And berberine and oxacillin show synergistic effect. Okay, or in other words, 1 + 1 = 3. So they target on different part or different mechanism to treat infection, and that's why they have synergistic effect more than just additive. All right, so the result is that berberine may be used along with these beta-lactam antibiotics to have much better overall effect to treat these infections. Okay, and if we dive into the pharmacology even more, okay, so how does Huanglian actually have antibacterial effect? How is it a bactericidal or how is it a bacteriostatic? So the specific pharmacology of Huanglian is that number one, it inhibits the bacterial DNA replication. So the bacteria's DNA cannot replicate, that means bacteria can no longer grow. So this is more of a bacteriostatic effect. It disrupts the bacterial protein synthesis. So if the bacteria cannot produce additional protein, it also cannot grow and multiply. So once again, it's mostly a bacterial static effect. Interfere with the bacterial glycometabolism. So once again, interfere with metabolism, mostly bacterial static. And then finally, destroys the bacterial cellular structures. So it breaks down the cellular structure, most likely the cell wall. And once the cell wall is broken or the bacterial cellular structure is broken, then the bacteria will die right away. So this last one here is bactericidal. And in fact, this is how the penicillin works. Penicillin works so well in the beginning because the penicillin compound is able to identify and break down cell wall, but it does nothing to the cell membrane, right? So if you remember, the biggest difference between human and bacteria is that human belongs to the animal kingdom and bacteria belongs to the plant kingdom. And the main difference is animal kingdom, the cells are made out of cell membrane. And in the plant kingdom, the cells are uncovered by cell wall. Okay, so penicillin is able to destroy the cell wall to kill bacteria, but it does nothing to cell membrane. And that's why it works so well to treat infection and has relatively little toxicity to the humans. So Huanglian has some of that similarity that it's able to destroy this bacterial cell structure. But generally speaking, for those of you who have taken Huanglian before, in most cases, there's little or no side effect. Okay, so that's one of the reasons. Okay, and before we move on to the next topic, something I wanted to say, but I did not put it here, is that even though Huanglian Su berberine is used in China as an antibiotic drug, even though it's available here in the United States, be careful not to use it too much or rely on it too much. And the reason is because it's a one compound substance that if you use it too much, if you use it when it's not necessary, eventually you will run into the same problem as you do with the antibiotic drugs. And that is mutation of the bacteria and ineffectiveness of the compound. And in fact, they do see this in China. Use of the compound by itself, even though it's very effective, is associated with much faster resistance and intolerance, or resistance and mutation of the bacteria, where the compound becomes ineffective. Okay, so whenever possible, it's best to use Huanglian as a single herb, and even better to use an herbal formula with Huanglian in it as an herbal formula. And the reason is because whenever you're treating infection, it's never just the bacteria by itself. It's the bacteria that cause the infection, that cause inflammation, that have other complications that affect many different parts of the body. So if you're practicing as a holistic practitioner, you really need to treat the entire person. So you need to have some herbs that have antibacterial effect. You need to have some herbs that have anti-inflammatory effect. If it's, for example, affecting the lung and the patient has sputum, has phlegm, has cough, then you may need some herbs that help to smooth the lung qi. You may need some herbs that have antipyretic effect or phlegm eliminating effect to clear the lung. And that's how you can treat the entire person. Okay, so don't fall into the trap of using just Huanglian Su or berberine, and then that's it. That's your only treatment. Okay, so that's a bit too narrow-minded. All right, next herb that's very frequently used is an herb called Huangqin scutellaria. So once again, this is what the herb looks like in nature, and also what the bulk herb looks like if you happen to use bulk herb. Okay, Huangqin scutellaria is another excellent herb. So it's able to clear heat, dry dampness, clear heat and sedate fire, and also clear heat and eliminate toxins. So basically for treating different presentations of heat at different parts of the body. When the term is used for a clear heat and dry dampness, basically damp heat often refers to a more specific part of the body. So if you remember, the terms we use may include damp heat in the liver, damp heat in the gallbladder, damp heat in the lower jaw, right? So that usually means a more localized infection. Okay, so maybe that's hepatitis, maybe that is liver infection, maybe that's urinary tract infection. So more isolated to a specific part of the body. If you see the term heat and fire, generally that means a more systemic issue. Okay, so heat and fire, more severe and more systemic. Okay, and then finally, if you see clear heat and eliminate toxin, once again, toxin usually mean there's something that's more substantial. So maybe a nodule, maybe a hardness, maybe there is some kind of abscess or discharge. So think of cellulitis, think of abscess, that kind of infections. All right. And then from a pharmacological perspective, this herb has antibacterial, antitoxin, antiviral, antifungal, and also antiparasitic effect. Okay, and there are many more, but I only list the ones that are more specific to our discussion today. So once again, antibacterial, antiviral are two of the main pharmacological effect as far as treating infections go. It also has antitoxin effect. So as it kills the bacteria, it also treats the toxic effect that comes as the bacteria releases the endotoxin. Okay, so very, very similar to Huanglian. And once again, like we mentioned, Huangqin, if you want to narrow it down further, is more effective for upper jiao, which is lung infection. And Huanglian, if you want to narrow it down a little bit more, is more specific for middle jiao, which is gastro or stomach or GI infection. Okay, it's not the only effect or the only action. It's a lot more than that. All right. Huangqin, in this case, has two main effective compounds that are studied the most. So Huanglian has berberine, one main effective compound, and Huangqin's Guttularia has two. One is Beicay-Len, and the other one is Beicay-Lin. Okay, so you can see the difference is really in the last three alphabets, L-E-I-N or L-I-N. Okay, and both of them, in fact, are studied quite a bit and have very specific effect. So once again, just like Huanglian coptis, Huangqin's Guttularia has a wide spectrum or inhibitory effect against many bacteria, including Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Diplococcus, Pseudomonas, Bacillus. Okay, many different type of Bacillus, gonorrhea, H. pylori, Salmonella, E. coli, cholera, and so on and so forth. Okay, so once again, it's a very powerful and very broad spectrum herbal antibiotic. And of all the microorganisms, it's most effective against Staphylococcus aureus, which is one of the most common pathogen, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is one of the hardest to treat pathogen. So it's effective against the most common and also most difficult to treat bacteria. Okay. As far as Beicay-Len is concerned, it has antibacterial effect by affecting the bacterial membrane penetrability and also inhibit the protein synthesis and DNA activities. So this herb, based on the description, would have both bacterial static and also bactericidal effect. Okay, and for the other compound, which is Beicay-Len, it has been shown to have synergistic effect when combined with ampicillin, amoxicillin, methicillin, cefotaxime. Okay, so these are some of the earlier commonly used antibiotic to some of the very strong and very potent antibiotic. And basically, when Beicay-Len is combined with these beta-lactam antibiotics, it's able to restore the effectiveness of the drug against methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. So once again, this is an excellent example of herb-drug interaction in which the use of the herb, or in this case, a compound Beicay-Len, with the drug is able to restore the effectiveness of the drug against a very resistant MRSA. Okay, so once again, combination of the two help to lower the dose of the drug, reduce side effect, and or increase overall treatment success. Okay, another main benefit here is Beicay-Len, or another main benefit of why this herb has such a wide or broad spectrum of antibiotic effect is that Beicay-Len is able to disrupt the microbial biofilm formation. And that in turn helps to kill many different bacteria. And you may wonder what exactly is biofilm. And what it is as bacteria enter the body, okay, if they are naked, meaning if they just exist by itself in the blood, for example, then what happens is it's very easy for our macrophage, for our T cells, for our white blood cells to identify and kill these bacteria if they are naked without protection. But what happens is, as a way to survive, the bacteria have evolved to secrete and produce biofilm. Okay, so what you can see here is that the bacteria is the brown or black wiggly thing, and as they produce biofilm, it's almost like a glob or a wall or a house where the bacteria can grow and multiply unaffected. Because what happened is our immune system, whether it's macrophage or T cells or B cells or white blood cells, cannot penetrate biofilm to identify and kill these bacteria. So bacteria grows uninhibited until when they are ready, then they are dispersed throughout the body. And once they are dispersed throughout the body at this point, there is a much larger number of bacteria, and our immune system did not get a warning sign, and all of a sudden they are bombarded with so much bacteria. And that's how the infection can become so much worse within a short period of time, because the biofilm helps to protect the bacteria as they grow. But what happened is Bakelin is able to disrupt this microbial biofilm formation. And without this biofilm, the bacteria cannot grow the same way, cannot multiply the same way, and therefore won't have the same effect to infect the body. All right, so the biofilm, according to this study here, helps to protect the microorganism by alternating the pH, the osmolarity, the nutrients, and protect them against the antibiotics, which is synthetic and host own immune system. Okay, so Huangqin somehow is or Bakelin somehow is able to disrupt the biofilm, and this then, on a very broad basis, is able to enable the body's immune system or the drugs to attack the bacteria at an early stage all across the board. And that's why it's such an effective herbal antibiotic. All right. And then these are some of the herbs that you probably have never heard of. Okay, so earlier we mentioned that there are 3 herbs with huang or yellow, right? Huang qin, Scutellaria for upper jiao, Huang lian, Coptis for middle jiao, and Huang bai, philodendron for lower jiao, and they all have huang in it. And once again, huang refers to yellow, which is a heat condition, and that's why those 3 herbs have those names to imply that they treat the heat condition. Okay, these are 5 other herbs with huang in it. Okay, and in this case, this huang is not yellow, so this huang is not the same as the other huang. And these herbs are not the same as those other herbs. So the yellow herbs are some that we all learned in TCM school that we're all very familiar with, but these ones are quite different. But also at the same time, they're the same. So I will come back to this a little bit later, and I think it's very interesting. But you'll have to stick around to the end to find out. All right. The next one. Actually, why don't we take a break first? So let's take a break for 10 minutes before we go into the antiviral section, because it's going to be another long section. So we'll come back in 10 minutes.